And next up on our side, a little different perspective. We have Lisa Brown from Johnson Controls, and they have a separate division that focuses totally on smart cities. She's going to give us some insights on the buildings and things to consider from that. So with that, Lisa.
Thank you, George. Not different, not that much different. I actually spoke at Deloitte Academy down in Texas, I think 5 years ago, on what Smart Cities was, and the first consumer electronics show, I think 2 years ago, that had Smart Cities Pavilion. I was there with Deloitte as well on a panel. So, and I was also with Mayor Mason when he won his Smart Cities Council Award. So this is like kind of
didn't know that. Yeah.
Mayor, I have to get to know Kenosha better, so then I can have a little thing to say as well. But thank you, George.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. It's very exciting, and I thought that I would add a little bit more to the conversation in terms of starting at healthy buildings. And at Johnson Controls, we've been in the smart buildings, we've been in the sustainability space for many decades. And over this last year that we've all seen so much shift and change and resiliency, the whole pandemic really brought in the concept of how do I show my citizens and constituents and potential tourists or visitors that I care about them, that my buildings are healthy, that it's okay to start entering back in, come out of shelter in place and build towards the recovery. So we did a little research in that area, and I think that's the conversation we've been having, where it's healthy buildings that build into smart connected buildings that then move into smart cities. You can see on the front slide, similar to what you had said, Joe, I don't call it smart cities anymore. We call it secure, connected, and resilient communities. It's more inclusive, it's rural, it's counties, it's regions, it's corridors, it's community areas, there's everything. So in addition to just being smart cities, which, excuse me, you can't swing a cat without hitting, 20 different definitions, trying to figure out and listening to mayors like these two esteemed gentlemen, as well as my colleagues for the last 8 years. I've been looking at smart cities. Those are the swim lanes that I've been seeing, and we get into a little bit more of that. So the new municipal challenges, and I'm sure that I'm going to be repeating some of the things that the mayors are saying, it's all about that constituent and citizen, and I'll throw visitor in there, confidence. How do we get folks back out of their homes and now back into libraries? How do we get families back into community centers? How do we get folks back into doing their civic duties in courthouses and being on juries? How do we get parks and recreation to be fully functional? How do we innovate and also maximize our police and fire? So it's getting that back in, using that built environment. And we have uncertainty in future economic landscape. I'm on the privilege of being on the phone with the White House Intergovernmental Affairs and also the Treasury on a weekly basis through the National League of Cities. And we talk about the relief funds, and we talk about the different allowable uses that it's there. But at the end of the day, mayors and other municipal leaders have been strangled by absolutely no funding for the last year. The first CARES Act was incredibly restrictive. It only went to, I think, 36 cities and counties across the entire country. A lot of folks don't realize that it had to be over 500,000 above in terms of population. So that didn't really happen. The next wave completely left out state and local governments. This last wave of the American Rescue Plan of the $350 billion for state and local, 165 went pretty split down the middle to cities and to counties. And mayors, I've been on the phone where mayors are being so mindful of understanding the allowable and eligible uses so that they're seen as being very prudent in the way that they're spending, but it's simply a Band-Aid because so much money was lost in terms of revenue opportunities and permitting and everything else that actually happens in their particular municipalities. That is truly now the next step until we get to the infrastructure bill that we think is going to be coming out that they're challenged with right now in DC, and figuring out how much money is going to be coming, and then what type, and then defining what infrastructure means. Is it social infrastructure, which is healthcare and caregiving, and even I heard K through 12 put in the concept of social infrastructure, or is it traditional infrastructure, which is more of that built environment, it's transit, it's mobility, et cetera, et cetera. So future economic landscape, mayors and city leaders are always dealing with that. Competition is interesting. We saw during the pandemic that there were folks that were thriving living at home. There are other folks that really wanted to get back to the office, but it showed a real spotlight on the fact that people can live wherever they want these days, and that municipal leaders would continually speak with me and say, I'm competing for citizens and constituents. I'm competing to keep businesses. And while you too have very sizable cities, big cities, like I appreciate you bringing up my hometown, New York City, people were just fleeing, and Chicago, everywhere else, because they realized they could live in the suburbs. They could realize they had a Zoom meeting or Teams meetings, and they could communicate effectively as they got used to working with their constituents and citizens that way. So it's opened up a whole new area, and that hybrid model is here to stay. There are a lot of folks that are going back full-time. There are a lot of folks that want to stay hybrid. And there are other folks who never want to take their pajamas off. And that's okay, too. I think most corporations realize extreme value in having their people at home. The productivity level went up. The overhead went down. And so that was, so competition. How are they, and I have mayors consistently tell me, I almost need to rebrand myself. How am I the healthiest city, the happiest city, whatever, because they want people to come and live and work and serve in their areas. So that's the competition that I don't think we've ever really seen that level of competition, and it's global. Communications, we talked a little bit about that, just the ability to actually speak with their citizens and their constituents, talking about what was closed, what was the curfew, what were mandates, what was going to be opening, how they could permit, was the motor vehicle open, was it not open, what do you do online? We realized that there was a real communications gap, and you talked about the underserved communities, which that was a dire need, and we work a lot in public housing as well. And so, but it was across the board in terms of children who couldn't. I was in Puerto Rico last week speaking with the Senate down there, and they had huge parts of the island that the children couldn't even connect to their schools. So they were completely left, floating, which was awful. We talked about recovery mode, budget shortfalls, services interrupted. I know that in many cases, and I'm interested in hearing from the mayors, that when the budget shortfalls happened and critical services couldn't be delivered, that they either stopped them altogether or they passed to some nonprofits that actually kept them going. And so I know that was something that is now being brought back. So many government workers, I think it was over 1.3 or 1.4 million were furloughed. And so that's the challenge, bringing, and that money, again, that we just talked about, that relief fund, a lot of that is for bringing back furloughed employees as well. So making sure there's emergency services and waste and everything else. And then anticipating the next set of public needs. I'm very fortunate to sit on co-chair Denton's, which is an international law firm. I think it's the largest one in the world, pandemic and crisis response. They have a wonderful Smart Cities initiative. You asked before in terms of where to start. There are tons of places, and I'm sure Mayor Mason will talk about Smart Cities Council. They have huge accelerators where they're building databases of this is the use case, this is where it's been done before, this is how successful it was, this is what the ROI was, et cetera. National League of Cities is working on primers. I know that the World Economic Forum is working on actually creating, I'm on a public-private partnership primer development work subcommittee there. They're doing a Smart Cities primer as well. So there's tons of resources that are out there. And then, we'll talk a little bit more about adaptive, the space utilization that has been happening, and being the smart buildings folks, we're really on top of that. Just getting people back in their areas and understanding that they need different space in order to be functional. So being adaptive, being flexible is going to be able to achieve those goals, and especially when you wrap technology all around it. So we did speak with folks. We spoke to about 400 different municipal leaders over 2020 to ask what they thought their first step to going back and then creating that confidence recovery. And they said, I want my buildings, and I'll say built environment because it's more places and spaces. It's not just buildings. I need to show them that it's healthy. I want people to walk in with confidence. I want folks to start using this again. So we'll go a little bit, I'll go pretty quickly through this, sorry, on what a healthy building is. It's similar to the Smart Cities definitions or resiliency definitions. What is a healthy building? And if you look right there, we talked about 400 people, and the top thing was space utilization, people counting, social distancing, PPP, protective gear. That was at 83%. Then remote video conferencing, we talked about that. Clean air, we do clean air assessments on a daily basis because that's the first step on that healthy buildings piece. Access in terms of how you're getting in terms of safety, water filtration. We haven't even gotten, we could probably have a whole other conference just on water resiliency and talking about how that's one of the fundamental, I guess, stools, the three legs of the stools for smart cities. And then facilities and then disaster response. So healthy workspace was at the top because, again, they want people back in the workspace. They know they're going to be using it differently, and they want people to be functional. So this is over the next 12 months what folks are going to be planning on in order to make buildings healthier. And I'm proud to report that government was right up there. Not always the early adopters, but absolutely was interested in actually investing in more resources for their healthy buildings. So that was a big deal. And you can see, I always look at all the verticals because I think all verticals fall within smart cities. I don't think it's just government. I think it's all the different verticals, and also citizens are a big piece of that as well. So it's government, but I think these things, umbrellas all over those particular verticals. Mm-hmm. So again, very excited to say that of all of the verticals, government was at the top in terms of implementing healthy building initiatives. And I can imagine that the mayors here would say it's because they had to. They had to be leaders, and they had to show people that there was recovery, and there was they had to actually do that investment. So I think that's a lot of the money that was spent over the pandemic and then the recovery period is how all that particular implementing cleaner air, better access control, greater security, ensuring that folks know that the buildings were cleaned, how they were clean, understanding monitoring, how people use the individual areas. So that was very important as well. So, and this is universal spending across all industries. Again, we see that of all the industries that are there and all the verticals at the bottom, clean air was the number one. It was the first thing that people looked at. How do I get my heating and cooling system at its peak performance? And how do I make sure that the building automation system that I have understands when the building is heavily used versus when it's not heavily used? Certain areas, like in libraries, where were folks more? I have to clean that air more versus other areas where they're being more efficient. Because at the end of the day, it's all about efficiency and economic development. So we talked about confidence, and I know I've been using that word a lot, but really it's that broader view. Right here there's a lot of bullet points, and I won't go into them in terms of healthy buildings and then kind of the steps you can take in order to design a holistic system there. But it's really more about improving safety and technology and efficiency, and every single municipal leader I've talked to always says it's about the citizens. It has to be about somehow showing a better quality of life, better services, and an ability to actually give them more so that they retain in their particular area. So making and creating. So I love this slide because it shows the new expectations. You talked a little bit about streetlights. We call them vertical assets at this point because they do so much more than just lighting. They can have gunshot detection. They can have evacuation planning. They can do traffic management. They can do a whole host of things. But they need to be more elegant. I don't know if you remember the days when people were starting to put so much, the smart buildings, they called them Franken poles because there was so much technology hanging off them. Now, if you look at that one in the corner, and as well as the one that you showed, they're very elegant because we're actually seeing all these technologies converging, which is great. I have a drone that seems to fly over my house every day, and I'm getting really used to it. My dogs aren't so happy, and neither's my husband. But that seemed to be something, it's the experience. And then at the bottom, I actually borrowed some of your airport analogies. It's that hybrid experience that we're kind of used to in airports already, being digital but also being present. And I think that citizens, there were some real silver linings that came out of this pandemic. And if we can focus on that and knowing that there was some great loss as well, there were some great things in order for people. I mean, I've become very technically astute, much more. My parents became technically astute. And so I think a lot of us learned that we can get and we can be very productive that way. So a lot of these hybrid experiences are happening. So what drives that secure, connect, and resilient communities? And these are just 6 areas that I see are drivers. We talked about adaptive environments and understanding how people need to work and desire to work and reimagining those spaces. Sustainability we haven't gotten a lot into. That's another part of the conversation, that net zero carbon emissions. I have not spoken to a mayor in the last 3 months that has not said to me, hey, Lisa, you know what? I know we want to do investments and we want to build, but we want to make sure that we're making sustainable investments, and we also want to make sure that it's good for the environment. One, because I care, and two, because my citizens are watching, and because my children, I want to make sure that the planet is around for them. So that net zero carbon emissions, I think that's a big piece. Our company actually joined the Amazon pledge. I don't know if you did that as well, where we agreed to get net zero carbon emissions for our particular company by 2030. And that's 10 years ahead of the Paris Affairs. And many mayors are looking at that as well. I'm really interested in hearing about what you're doing there too. Resiliency in the midst of the climate change, that kind of goes along with sustainability, but resiliency often, and I have a slide that focuses on that, that's another one that has so many different definitions. Some folks will say resiliency is workforce enhancement and making sure their local labor force is lifted. Others will say it's pandemic and crisis response. Others will say it's predictive analytics on their building systems. Others think that it's putting a microgrid in place. So whatever, smart cities are different everywhere, the word resiliency and the definition, and it really depends on what that individual city's priorities are. Efficiency, we talked about that with budget shortfalls. At the end of the day, it has to be about economic vibrancy. It cannot be a science experiment of just investing in technology for technology's sake. And I have seen the cities that embrace their citizens' voice, as well as nonprofits' voice and faith-based leaders, et cetera, along with government voice, are the ones that actually build the best models, and generally it ends, at the end of the day, it's about vibrancy. And then you talked a lot about IoT and data, Joe, and the proliferation of, there's more devices than there are humans on this planet. And the one thing they have in common is they all emit data. So what we can do with that data, how we can package it, how we can be aware of it, how we can potentially monetize it, that's another revenue opportunity. Sensitive subject, not so much anymore, because municipal leaders used to say, oh, I have to be really careful. Now they're searching for ways to create revenue, and citizens, if they're involved from the beginning, are willing at one level to be able to give data away if you have services that come back. So there has to be a nice balance there. So just a quick thing on secure, my secure, connect, and resilient is security can be, I think it's cybersecurity as well as public safety. And we've been seeing a lot of that in the news. It's got to be both sides. And so security is a really big driver. People want to live in a safe place. They want to raise their children. They want to shop. They want to serve in that individual area. And so municipal leaders know that that's a big deal as well. Very interestingly enough, we found that the word connected really resonated over the pandemic recovery, and it's connecting people. We talked a little bit about that before, and making sure everyone underserved, as well as everyone else that's in the population. You're building systems that need to be connected for efficiency's sake, and then as we had furloughed government employees, there was less staff to be able to take care of those buildings, and then connecting buildings to make smart campuses, to make smart corridors, and then ultimately smart cities. So it's that connectivity that actually ultimately improves the citizens' lives and constituents and businesses, and it makes those efficiencies that hopefully make it easier on municipal government as a whole. And then we talked a little bit about resilient and what we think that the definitions are. And that's one of the things that we start our conversations off. What do you decide? What is your definition of resiliency? Because it's so different. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in smart cities. And I will say, I think the term started about 10 years ago. Deloitte was one of the forefathers of actually starting smart cities. But that overall definition has been so difficult to actually pin down, because there's no ability to pin down, because every single city and municipality and county is different, has their own priorities. So scaling this has been a challenge, although there's a lot of activity in terms to do that, and a lot of people that are very smart that are putting that in place. And that's what I have. Thank you, George.
No, great information, Lisa. One of the points you mentioned was going from smart cities, or a term that's very broad, to smart communities. And one of the questions that came up was, do you define a community geographically like you do a city, or does it go beyond borders from cities? Any particular thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, I think it can be both. I think when we think of communities, you can think of that as geographical, but you can also, on the other side, you can think of it as the voices that are in that community, and they don't always have to be on that same block or that same region or that same part of the city. So I think it actually is both, and it's important to get that wide base of the community that's involved. When projects move forward, and you did mention Toronto and a couple other, and the places where they've gone sideways, that's so much learning rewarding for all of us. So it's wonderful that there's early adopters that are out there. But where citizens, where, like I said, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, as well as government come together and actually create the model together, that's where I think, and that's where community also comes from as well. Even in departments on larger cities, sometimes they've been competing for budgets. They might have sat, I've had people that have sat in navigation or ideation sessions where we've brought together and tried to figure out what collective goals will be and then how we're going to move forward. People have sat together for 10 years and didn't even know they were fighting for the same budget. So, and realized once they aligned, they didn't have to fight for it anymore. They were getting the same outcome. So, yeah.
Got it. And Lisa, you mentioned also, COVID has definitely affected all of us in the way we live, work, and play. Given that people no longer need to live in high-cost cities or high-crime cities, they can pretty much live anywhere they want to. Thoughts on this concept now that seems to be gaining momentum around, the ideal place to live, work, and play, to raise a family, to engage in different activities. Any particular thoughts on that or how that is going to form or go forward?
Yeah, I think it's a very personal decision. And I think that if cities that are more proactive in ensuring that they have the services that are in place, ensuring that their brand is known as a healthy and livable city. And I will say it's the work, live, and play. I'll also say and serve, because there's a lot of folks that actually want to dig in and help their communities. So that's very important. But yeah, I absolutely think that it depends on the individual community, and it depends on the individual person. Some people love to live out in the country, and if they have fiber that's in place, well, that's fantastic, right? And other people are aching to get back into the cities, big urban cores, which is where all the folks were flooding to. I think prior to the pandemic, they talked about 70% of the world's population being in urban cores by, I think, 2050, I think it was the United Nations said. And then that halted and shifted a bit, and they're coming back, but they're reimagining those places. So, but not everybody wants to work back in the city. So I think that there's so much more flexibility and options for folks, and that's why there's a lot of competitions between.
No, and I think you bring up a good point, and I didn't realize this until not too long ago, that like 98% of the cities are, thousands and thousands of cities, but 98% of them are under 100,000 in population. So I think that's something that's very, very important for individuals to realize as well, that not all cities are huge. You have to find a way to work with 100,000 and less size cities, particularly when such a large portion of them is in that category. So
and there's a lot of beauty and innovation that comes from smaller cities because they are more nimble and they are able to move forward. But some of them engage their citizens differently. And larger cities do beautiful work as well. So again, there's no one size fits all for smart cities, and a lot of people are doing great work.
Lisa, I want to follow up on that. You mentioned engagement, use the term engaging citizens. Have you seen anything in particular that works well for engaging citizens? Because again, if the citizens are your customers, you need to focus on what their needs are. Any thoughts on the engagement concept or aspect?
So I'll throw out a couple names that I like. I think that Greg Fisher in Louisville does an amazing job in engaging his community. He has fireside chats. He literally walks, and I'm sure these mayors do that, always walk around and talk to their citizens constantly. Where I have seen smart city kind of conversations or developments and bringing citizens in, I've seen cities such as Miami Beach that we work with that hired a marketing communications company and actually had many little focus groups around the city, asking what they wanted, and it depended. In the different neighborhoods, they had different needs, and there was different culture, et cetera. I've seen cities where they have done large surveys, where they'll send out surveys to their entire citizen, base, and then follow it up with multiple. Now it's electronic newsletters, et cetera, in order to gauge if we did this, what would you be willing to do? What would you be willing to pay? Where would you be able to live? Would you pay more rents if it was this type of a building, if it was LEED certified, if it was more connected, if it was well building certified, et cetera. So I've seen them engage with surveys. I've seen them engage with fireside chats. I've seen them engage with engaging marketing communications companies and bringing them together. And I've always seen it to be positive, because if you see any ouches, they come out early, and not to the end when you're trying to vote on something and they show up with pitchforks at your town hall meeting, which will happen. So the earlier you engage with your end users, who are your citizens and your constituents and business owners, the better it is. And I think the more productive everything will be.
Got it.
Thank you, George.
Question from the local community. Given the unique business growth of Southeast Corridor in Wisconsin, do you agree that planning within each Southeast community should consider how they all plug into the future smart corridor? And I know some people refer to I-94 as that smart corridor between Chicago and Milwaukee. So I'm assuming that's what they're referring to here. Any thoughts on that?
So, and interestingly enough, I've had conversations with counties, similar conversation, where they've tried to get there, and there's one in particular that we're working on with the Smart Cities Council where they're bringing 11 of their cities together. Now, there's going to be different needs in those different cities, but sometimes when that voice is aligned, they're able to share resources. They might be able to get together and work on multiple grants that they can kind of work together on. They can share investment costs. You talked a little bit about public-private partnerships. That's definitely something that we focus on considerably. And it was more of an interest rather than a commitment here in the United States. I know we had a question from Canada. They are a well-oiled machine in terms of public-private partnerships up there. They've been doing it forever, as well as Europe. I have been hearing the conversation with mayors in the last few years shifting more towards being open to having public-private partnership. One, because the money just is required. Two, because that risk appetite I think there's more innovators that are sitting in mayors and city leader seats, and they understand that it's really business that they're running. And so that's a really important piece. But if you can take different funding mechanisms, and if you can maybe tie different cities together, or communities, or counties, et cetera, I think that there's nothing but positive that comes out of collective voices that are working together. Even if they end up not doing a larger initiative, then they're aware of each other's, and maybe they take on different needs, and then they track to see the success in their individual neighboring communities. So corridor, absolutely. Corridor can be a corridor which actually runs multiple cities. It can also be, I know there's one city that was working on having an anchor. I think there was a school on one side and there was a hospital on the other side, and it was like a mile-long individual avenue, and they called that a smart corridor. So it really depends on the definition.
Got it. Okay. Another question that's come in. What is a best practice to ensure collaboration in creating secure, connected, and resilient communities?
See? They're using my little voice, my word. I think a best practice is to get the right stakeholders in place. There are multiple things that I think are foundational in terms of giving yourself the right foundation to move forward. Making sure the right stakeholders are in place and getting them involved early. Talking to technology integrators and making sure that your technology is either not obsolete, you can't future proof, but you can certainly future ready, or to have technology that has been kind of on its own. So we don't want anything that's been deserted. We also don't want anything that's going to be interoperable. So it's not going to be working with all the other technologies. So making sure you have that integration partner or partners is important. Stakeholders are important. That funding discussion. Talk to your financial folks internally. Talk to your banks that are external. Talk to partners that can bring that financial discussion to make sure what's comfortable for you. Because not everybody's going to have the same threshold for risk or interest in terms or interest in like managing and ownership models as well. I also think that it's really important to track that and put some governance in place and measuring success, because it's really easy to do a ton of different technology or a ton of different projects and not bring them collectively and say, okay, how have we really moved the needle to make my city or my county or my community smarter. So having those things in place, and then not being afraid to innovate, putting something in place that's maybe from 6 to 12 months, more goals that are 1 to 3 years, and then those 5-year goals that are out there. Because everyone wants to race and have those flying drones or have everything else that's out there, but you have to start on what's the first thing, and you need to be able to show success to your community so your citizens will continue to support you. So I think those are the areas that you can start as best practices and then off to the races.
Here's a more global question. Insights on best practices in various countries around the world. Any leading countries? Some people, and I've seen this as well, some people say, unfortunately the U.S. is not the center of smart cities or connected communities. What else is going on around the world from your experiences? And are there any lessons individuals in the U.S. and around the world can learn from other countries? Right.
So I will say, because I get that question from our global partners all the time, why is the United States not cresting towards like a whole new, we're like 50 different countries. that have all different legislation, that have different regulatory environments, that have different procurement processes, down to, that's the states, then you get down to the regions. And I bet that Mayor Mason here and the mayor from Kenosha probably have different procurement policies as well. So it's really challenging for the United States. We don't have any federal smart city policy that's in place. The current administration is now pushing more towards advancing an efficient infrastructure and also sustainability. But in terms of smart cities, and that's part of it, but in terms of smart cities, we don't have any federal mandates that are in place. There's other countries that are smaller in size that do. And they can all work together. Singapore is a wonderful example of some real technical innovation. Dubai, that I've had the real opportunity to work there, and they're doing amazing things. Countries in Scandinavia are ones to look at, and they're doing amazing things. They've had great discussions. And the entire, I would say, for the most part, Australia has had the ability to actually work as one collective. The mayors down there have been working for many, many years in order to how to actually pull things together and have that one voice. So that's, and there's many, many other places. Boston's doing some phenomenal work right now. San Diego has been doing some great work in terms of connected street lighting. Columbus got that Department of Transportation goal or grant that was that like 3 years ago or whatever? And they're doing 5 years, was it 5? I'm getting so old. They're doing amazing work because they took that 50 million and they went from there. So there are pockets, and there's great things being done in, I would say, every state. You just have to look.
Good, very good. Lisa, I think one of your coworkers has submitted a question.
Oh,
so here we go.
It's not gonna be a softball.
Johnson Controls has actually created a separate division called Open Blue.
Yes.
To focus on smart cities technology. Any insights on how and why it got started and the future direction of Open Blue?
So Open Blue is more than smart cities. It's about smart buildings. It's about smart hospitals. It's about smart industry. And it's all about digital transformation. I think that Joe was touching upon that. How to make sure that your platforms, your people, your systems, and your buildings are all talking together, all collective, and are generating data that can help you make better data-driven decisions. So yeah, there's tons of information that I could share on Open Blue. I'm happy to share that with whoever's on the phone, and we're delighted. We kicked it off about a year ago, and our customers are very happy.
Got it. I think you just made a coworker happy as well.
There you go.
So, another question's come up is the difference. There seems to be a lot of focus on technology, but in common here, in the end, we know it's people that make projects successful. So can you give us some insights on the trade-off between focusing on technology in a project versus people?
Yeah. And I would actually even to look to the mayors who know their people better. I think it has to be a combination. I think at the end of the day, it has to enhance the quality of your life for people, including government and the workers, including the citizens and the businesses. But in order to get there, the enabler in many cases is technology. So we need technology, but again, it can't be technology for technology's sake. We have seen that. A lot of money has been spent. And I think that's how smart cities started at the beginning. It was more government handing down technology, innovative solutions about 10 years ago, and the ROI wasn't there. So it kind of shifted to more of an outcome-based solution where they started at the outcomes and went from there. And then I think it shifted again a few years ago that went to a citizen and government voice collectively getting together in order to make the decisions and building the city of the future. So technology is very important. It's just, it's so easy to have stranded technology if you don't work with those integrators. And so again, I get back to make sure you work with integrators or integrators, more than one, as part of that stakeholder group, so you're making the right decisions and investments for your own community.
Got it. And another one here, part of your presentation focused on buildings, and they've come a long way. And with new buildings, the assumption is that sensors and all the engagement is easier than existing buildings. What is the challenge with having existing buildings or historical buildings and try to retrofit them as compared to building from scratch if you have that luxury?
Historical buildings. That's a whole other conversation. Earlier in my career at Johnson Controls, I was fortunate to be part of retrofitting the Empire State Building. And that was quite an iconic experience, I will say, for that iconic building. We even built a window factory on one of the floors because there was historical neat glazing and everything else that was required. We are a mature built environment here in the United States if we're talking about North America. If we're talking about places in China, or we're talking about places in the Middle East where you can basically build a city from scratch, that would be ideal because you're starting with brand new systems and everything's going to be connected and there's tons of sensors and you have the right partners, et cetera. But we don't have that luxury here as often. I mean, there's occasionally a new courthouse is built here. Occasionally something gets ripped down and replaced. We are in a retrofit space here. So I think that there's the ability to actually be successful in new building construction as well as retrofits. We actually have both sides on our company we have to focus on. But I would say if you're in the United States, you're basically going to be in a retrofit environment. And so make sure you have the right engineers and the right visionaries and the right strategic folks and ultimately the right customers in place in order to make those decisions, because that's what we're doing. Reimagining spaces, and we talked about built environment, is all about that re-looking at how to make different office spaces, community spaces, government spaces more adaptive. And so I think throwing architecture in there and making sure you have smart architects there and planners and designers. Urban planners are getting a lot of attention these days because they're rolling up their sleeves and they're seeing how they can take places such as Midtown Manhattan and in Chicago and down in San Francisco and figure out how they can reuse it. We all sat and watched our favorite restaurants have spill out into the streets, and we sat in New York with our parkas, and I think there was snow at one point and my husband was eating around his plate, but we were so excited to be outside, and that's here to stay. There's beautiful green spaces that are being developed, and so I think there's a lot of intelligent people on that.
Good points, good points. No, Lisa, I think this is great. So thank you very much. Great insights, great answers to the questions. And with that, I appreciate what you've done.